Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody. This is our first in a series. We're reinvigorating Books Sandwiched In. It was a wonderful program many years ago at the New Haven Public Library, and we're very fortunate to have author Neil Proto, who will be discussing his book Fearless, A. Bartlett Giamatti and the Battle for Fairness in America. Neil Thomas Proto is an attorney, writer, and professor based in Washington, D.C., here in an MA in International Affairs in 1969, and a Juris Doctorate in 1972 at George Washington University. And let me not forget, Neil is a graduate of our wonderful public schools in New Haven, Wilbur Cross. Neil was chair of the organization Students Challenging Regulatory Agency Procedures, SCRAP, which fought for compliance by nation's railroads and Interstate Commerce Commission with the National Environmental Policy Act. Neil Proto has practiced law for 30 years as an appellate attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice, Environment and Natural Resource Division, 1972 to 1979, and in private practice. Since 1990, he served as adjunct professor at George Washington University Public Policy Institute, focusing on environmental values, energy choices, and urban policy. He's the author of numerous articles and books, including To a High Court, The Tumult and Choices That Led to United States of America versus SCRAP, The Rights of My People, Lily Ukulani's Enduring Battle with the United States, 1893 to 1917, and the centerpiece of tonight's talk, of course, Fearless, A. Bartlett Giamatti and the Battle for Fairness in America. Neil, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a joy to be connected to New Haven and to the library, especially.
Right, it saves the commute on Metro North or Amtrak. It's good. Thank God for Zoom. It's great. It's raining out.
I agree.
So Neil, I've read it. It's amazing. I mean, your footnotes equal the book. Can you tell us what the process of writing? I mean, what led you to this, or why? I know you've met Bart. I mean, I know in the book you've had a great occasion to meet Bart Giamatti in '79 at the request of, I guess, in the Alito administration. So in terms of this book, can you maybe talk about the writing process? And
Yeah, I'd be glad to, Seth. I describe in some detail in the acknowledgement portion of the book some of what I'm now going to describe in more summary form. I had the idea back in 2006 and 7 originally, and spoke with John Wilkinson, who was a friend of mine and was secretary of the university when Bart was president, and also they were classmates. And John encouraged me to look at it because Bart was really a radical departure. He was the first non-Anglo-Saxon president of Yale, and so the potential for an interesting exploration emerged. I put the idea aside for a bit, wrote the Lily Ukulani book that you referenced, and then went back to it. And I was quite taken by Giamatti. I had met him, as you also referenced, in '79. I co-chaired I was general chair of the mayoral committee, inauguration committee that was held at Yale for the first time in its history at Giamatti's request and suggestion. And I thought he would be an engaging, interesting person to examine. He was Italian-American, which mattered to me, that is on his father's side. His father's family was from New Haven. His father was born in New Haven, in Fairhaven, and baptized actually at St. Michael's. And so I thought there would be a logical connection, or a connection I could empathize with, or perhaps bring something to bear. And he also was a deep intellect. And of course, by the time I was focused on this, he had already been commissioner of baseball, and there was the Pete Rose controversy. When I got into the story, and just I'll close with this because I think it's important. When I got into the story, and I got deep into the research, and I had two wonderful historians that were helping me, the revelations about eugenics and about Yale's role in it, especially at the time when Bart's grandparents and his father were here, and his father went to Yale, and I'm happy to describe the details of that. He too was a public school graduate like we are. It really, that revelation and then Yale's role in urban renewal struck me so deeply and powerfully that it's a story that had not been told, certainly not by Yale historians, and I felt it needed to be. And so that becomes a critical thread, Yale's relationship to New Haven, of a university he eventually not only attends, but becomes the president.
You know, it's interesting with Halloween coming up, your book almost could fit in. I mean, I call it Nightmare on Elm Street when you think about the eugenics, that Institute of Human Relations. I mean, the way, you know, like we talk about public school, I always remember that word laboratory, Yale, thinking of the folks who have this laboratory, you know, wasn't, I'm going back to the 60s and 70s, the elitism, you know, and just this condescending nature. You know, you write about, well, I guess going back to, what's his name? Angel, Griswold. I mean, this connection to the South. I mean, there was these racist undertones or overtones, whatever. It's just in terms of just perpetuating the elite. And I guess
I think
really, it's just amazing. People, you know, underscore. I think you really, what a turn. I mean.
I think, Seth, let me just stick with this for a moment, because it is something worth exploring a little bit more. In the book and in the prologue, when I'm describing a little bit about the meeting between Bart Giamatti's father and mother before they actually become his parents, before they get married, I have a quote in here by Angel, the president of Yale, that I would like to read. It's just a sentence long, but I think it really would begin to tell a story that you're now were taken by, and I was deeply taken by. Here's what he says, quote, this is in 1933. Now, Bart Giamatti's father is a graduate student at Yale. And of course, Bart's grandparents are still alive. It seems quite clear, Yale President James Roland Angel wrote in 1933, as he surveyed the Italian and Jewish immigrant and African-American population that surrounded the university, that if we could have an Armenian massacre confined to the New Haven district, with occasional incursions into Bridgeport and Hartford, we might protect our Nordic stock almost completely, quote unquote. And so you have here the premise that eventually takes on a very vivid, painful reality, namely urban renewal. When 30,000 people are displaced, while Griswold is the president of Yale, A. Whitney Griswold, and what you see is this dramatic, 30,000 people, a dramatic transformation in the lives and neighborhood and culture of so many of these immigrants and African-American migrants in a way that radically altered their lives, but radically altered the nature of New Haven only, singularly, for the benefit of Yale University. And they understood it. One of the things that does leap out at you when you read it is how conscientious they were. Let me read you this. That Yale's response when they saw what Dick Lee was intended to do and how he embraced the plan they wanted was they were, quote, in line with long-term interests of the university. This is internal correspondence. 40 and 50 years hence, this land will be available for educational uses. For this goal to be reached, the Oak Street Connector, with all its radical effects, had to be built, though of no interest to Yale. It would clear the land of virtually everything and lessen the value of the private property that remained. Yale only had to be mindful, and this comes right out of their own archives, quote, there be no covenant entered into that blocks land for educational purposes on a tax-free basis, unquote. So Yale knew exactly what urban renewal would do and how to benefit from it, and they were privy to every decision that was made relative to urban renewal long before the public was told, and the public was almost never told truthfully.
I think growing up, we had this myth that thankfully to you, you've dispelled that in terms of decrepit thing. This housing stock was just had to be demolished, and it was, for the betterment of the population. But like you just clarified, I mean, there was these vibrant neighborhoods. And I remember, I don't remember my child's thinking, but I remember, in the 60s going to these Jewish delis, and it was phenomenal. It was the remaining, last commerce there. So there was, and it's just.
Well, it's a very sad commentary, and your remembrance is quite poignant, because I remember with my father, even though we lived in Fairhaven and then we lived in what was called the Annex for a period of time, we would go to up to the hill to Legion Avenue, or sometimes over to Grand Avenue, and you would go to exactly what you're describing, and we were at sort of the beginning of the end of that in when I was doing that with my father and mother, and it was painful what was done to those neighborhoods, and it wasn't necessary. And as I described, there were hundreds of buildings, viable, being used by industry, by business. There was something called there was Movie City that I didn't know about. That it was such a viable industry in New Haven. There were large buildings devoted to it, all destroyed, all demolished, in order to build in order to do urban renewal that had this singular beneficiary. But one last thing, just in this context, that I think is important to keep coming back to Giamatti.
Yeah.
He knew this. He disliked Dick Lee. He witnessed this. He heard it from his father. He heard it, and he comes in 1956 as a student. He sees this, and so and because he had family here, it got more personal. It got more affected by his values, by his principles, and so that was the relevance of Giamatti to urban renewal.
The notion of Giamatti being this fairness, like you say, just his whole life. I mean, from sports, and I love that part. As he was freshman or sophomore, when he connects with Ellis Scantlebury, I mean, who's a big civic leader in the Dixwell community, and just as a Yale student, you didn't see much of that. Like you're saying, the elite notion of there's the townies and but he and his father also, Val, I mean, didn't he, I think he taught, so there was always awareness of community, and
I think, Seth, you're right about that. And they both brought, think of it this way, and I try to describe this, that they did it in there were two sort of vehicles for doing this. One was, how do you stay deeply focused on the intellectual opportunities Yale offers without getting entangled in the culture? Well, Thomas Bergen, who was also from New Haven and who preceded Giamatti, really began to carve out, this is how you do it. And Bart's father did it, and Bart did it. So how do you take full advantage of the intellectual opportunities Yale, mostly from faculty and other places, but not get entangled in the elitist culture? That's one. And the second was, he did have a sensitivity. His father did. His father's youth was that way, to neighbors, to neighborliness, to community, to civic responsibility. And he taught at the community colleges in New Haven, and he got educated slightly in the predecessor to Southern Connecticut. Was interesting to me, where I went to college. And Bart did the same thing. And Ellis Scantlebury was someone he became very close to. And as I think I referred to in the book, when he was selected as president, and when they had these various events, including his dinner the night of his inauguration, she sat next to him. Right. He wanted her to be there. But more importantly, she helped him understand some aspects of New Haven, especially the power of the community participation in Dixwell, and how to ensure in that neighborhood, for her, Democrats won, which is what she wanted, but that the community remained vibrant, able. One of the stories I tell periodically when I'm asked is I had the benefit of having actually been in the original Dixwell Community House and we were playing a CYO, Catholic Youth Organization, basketball. And so we went over there, my brother who was coaching us at the time, we went over there to meet with people to talk about how would the game play, where would we change. Couldn't have been nicer, but I was so taken by how extraordinarily active that original building was, filled with, and she was a thread in that. And of course at St. Martin de Porres and elsewhere. And the kids were, of course, great basketball players. We had great fun and always lost.
Yeah, it's also interesting. I mean, you talk about John Daniels, Bruce Morris. I mean, longstanding politicians. I don't know if folks are listening in, but it's just, I don't know Bart's, relationship to John Daniels that became mayor. I mean, I don't know. I don't need to elaborate on that in the book, but I just wonder if you've found anything. I mean,
well, well, a little bit. I will say that John Daniels, I knew him really later when we were fighting the suburban shopping malls, and he was a state senator. And you'll see one endnote is strongly devoted to him, although there's actually two. Mm-hmm. But he was very active in that and testified and led an effort. And as we worked together to recognize what I'll characterize as the civil rights aspects of those fights. But before that, in 1961, he runs for the first time. And I talk about the importance of that election in New Haven's history. And he was one of the victors in the Dixwell, New Hallville area. And of course, Bruce Morris was as well. This is also when Henry Parker begins to emerge. And I discuss all of that because you really got a very radical change. It is also the time when Dick Lee barely wins. It really is the beginning of the end of his career. And there was opposition at that point by 61 throughout New Haven to the really beginning to recognize the harm that urban renewal was causing. And that recognition occurred everywhere, but it certainly occurred in that Dixwell, New Hallville area in a very serious way. You could see it in the people who were elected and what they went on to do. Daniels, let me just say one other thing about John. And you may know, just FYI, that at Southern Connecticut, we have an endowment we've created for the mayoral papers of DeLito, Daniels, and of course, John DeStefano had already begun to contribute his, and there'll be an exhibition of that next year. But John had not collected his mayoral papers. And so we've now taken a serious effort, made a serious effort at Southern, and I've been very involved in that in a number of forms. But for DeLito, the same thing. But let me come back to John. He and Bart would have known each other earlier. That is when Bart was still a student, because Bart was at Yale at the time, but John was beginning to emerge.
State senator, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, politically active. Well, as a senator because Yale was very helpful, and Giamatti and John Wilkinson were very helpful in fighting suburban shopping malls. They weighed in when they needed to on behalf of Yale, saying we support New Haven, and so they would have worked with John just as I did, but. There are two other things that worth mentioning about John Daniels. And in his way, he was extraordinarily principled. He was the first one to recognize that there was going to be a civil disturbance in the Hill. And in 1967, he wrote it. He and two other lawyers, and I wish I could remember their names off the top of my head because they were both, one of them was very prominent and Jewish. And I remember him that way. But they wrote a report that they gave to Dick Lee and to Kingman Brewster and said, there's going to be a problem here. You are neglecting this neighborhood. And that neighborhood still was largely African-American, but there were still remnants of Italian and Jewish immigrants there. And so he said, there's going to be a riot here. There's going to be a disturbance. They ignored it. And then it happened. And this was one place where this is one place where Yale and Giamatti had to be very conscious of this. This is one place where Kingman Brewster, when asked by the NAACP and a number of citizens groups to allow women and children to spend a night or two in a Yale residence hall, Pete, the churches in New Haven said yes, private residents said yes, as far as Hampden and North Haven people were saying yes, and they did it. But Kingman Brewster said no, and he said it personally. He would not allow women and children to spend the night in a Yale residence hall. So Daniels was, and Giamatti, perhaps in different ways, but at the same time, would have been very conscious of that failure of Yale to perform what Giamatti would have characterized as a civic responsibility. And the second thing that I did want to mention about John, he was a great football player. And I talk about that because he graduated from he played in the old Hill House High School. And when it was on this York Square campus, and I'm sure you've got some older viewers who will remember that campus and those schools and how important they were to the culture of New Haven and to the students who attended there. And so John played football there. My brother played basketball in 1958 too at the old Wilbur Cross when they were, the last year they played when they became state and then New England basketball champions.
I think he's the only mayor who never gave up his passion for refereeing. He couldn't, I think when he as a football referee is funny. That was his, I think, when I met him, because he was a neighbor, and he said, it's my greatest love or something. So I
would believe that. He had great athletic skill, and it started early in his life as a all-state football player at Hill House. He was great.
I just want to bring up, it's interesting to talk about Kingman Brewster. I was just reading Wikipedia, but I mean, I don't know if to call it a redeeming value, but in the Vietnam War protests, and I don't know if you brought it up, but it was funny. Kissinger, I don't know, he labeled enemy number one, or he said something rather crude. I mean, if anybody were going to assassinate Kingman Brewster, he was like on a hit list or wanted to be. So there was this, I mean, with these, anti-community policies at Yale, but did he redeem himself? I mean, during the Black Panther trial, or would you say with Brewster? I mean, it's got an ugly history, but, fast forward to maybe 1970, things happening on the Green. Do you see a different Kingman Brewster, or is it the things you're talking about? I mean,
I don't. I see a very pragmatic Kingman Brewster.
Okay.
And I see one who's very capable of how do you manage students who, at the time, wanted desperately to be like him. He was the model. And so how do you be a good white Anglo-Saxon Protestant and a Yale graduate? There's a model. And beyond the depth of that, I don't know if it was properly explored or explained. I don't mean to demean him in any way. Yeah. He did manage to, govern Yale for a long period of time. But in terms of his liberalism, I view it very differently. Look, there were 4 strikes when he was president. One of them was characterized as really a civil rights violation because there was blood, and this episode with the African-American community and denying space. Yale had become, throughout this time period, very expansive. He was a landlord in Dixwell, on the Hill, Legion Avenue, neighborhoods. So there are threads to his life that are much more pragmatically displayed in ways that some people would like to lean on. And again, I don't take it away from him, but I don't attribute to him what the mythology does. I learned too much.
Okay. Yeah, just going back to Bart's father, Val Giamatti, I found fascinating when being in Italy in the late 40s. And for me, it's a fascinating period. And I'll tell you, having lived in Moscow in the 80s and having a lot of contacts, just as Val did, his father with the Italian Communist Party, and these great stories and the role they played defeating fascism. So I know you didn't go into too much detail, but maybe the next book you could a drama, Val's these conversations he had. I would have loved to have been with him. I don't speak Italian. I mean, it's but I think
I think.
And I think Bart was there. Bart was a young boy. He was like 10. I mean,
Yes,
so
Bart was
yeah,
with them, and Seth, I'm glad
what
you
an
brought it up,
education.
because I think it was part of Bart's education was watching his father, and the boldness with which his father went into these neighborhoods and argued with people because he could speak the dialects, and he was able to go in and argue with them about communism and about democracy and why they should vote to support democratic order. And there were risks involved in what he was doing. And Bart was with him. And so Bart witnessed that. It was part of his education, part of what gave rise to his principles. And this is a time when Yale is, if you go back to the 30s, you see Yale providing funding, support, ideas, writings, in support of what was going on in Germany, in support of what was going on in Italy. This eugenics had huge pervasiveness at Yale, and it did at Carnegie, it did at Rockefeller, it did in a lot of these large nonprofits who were also funding this stuff. And you could see Yale playing, and so Giamatti's father would have witnessed and experienced that, and Bart knew it. And he saw that sort of it. And this also is where, and you alluded to it earlier, but I would be neglectful if I don't emphasize it. This is where Wilbur Cross plays the role that he did in eugenics. You can see back in 1925, while he's still on the faculty, he's talking about the creation of a secretary of eugenics in a speech he gives at Brown. Well, there was a deeper history to that. It turns out in 1913, he leads the effort to go south and to try to entice Southerners to contribute money and send students to Yale. But more importantly, he elevates, idealizes John C. Calhoun in a very deliberate way. And it's all reported. I found it. It was easy enough. It was in the Yale alumni magazines and in the local newspapers in South Carolina. So by the time he gets to be governor, Wilbur Cross is not only enforcing eugenics laws that existed in Connecticut, and first enacted in 1909, but Connecticut was the second state to do that. He's not only enforcing those, but more importantly, he institutes new studies. He elevates the depth with which he wanted government to intrude into people's lives, to institutionalize people they thought were unfit, and then to sterilize them, especially women. And so the number of sterilizations increases dramatically while Wilbur Cross is the governor. And he buys off on this new study. As a good fortune would have it, he loses the election. And so that was the end of his career. But you see this role that Yale played in this. And Giamatti was perfectly conscious of all that. He knew it. And it also helped form, as it did for his father, principles about how do you live? How do you conduct yourself? What's your duty as a citizen? And so that is deeply documented in the book, which comes out of the Yale, largely comes out of the Yale archives.
It's, you know, it's a sad, I mean, here I am at the library and I'm thinking, well, this is taking place with a block with all these activity in your book, you know, the Institute of Human Relations, and that incident where they had that street brawl, was it Wilbur Cross or Griswold invited the Hitler Youth Group or something that was a student group from Germany in the 30s. I mean, it's bizarre. So here it is like a block away. You know, it's, I mean, then I'm thinking now with Trump, we have, you know, all these other alt-right groups. It's, you know, it's like 90 years later. What's the difference?
Well, I think there's a lot to learn from those episodes. And certainly if you look at that one, and it was really athletes from Italy that came, supported by the Olympic Committee, which had its vote very pro-Hitler and pro-Mussolini.
Oh, I'm sorry, they're from Italy. I thought it was, okay, yeah.
No, but at the same time, there was already movements on the Yale campus that were very sympathetic towards Germany. And that does emerge in depth later, where Kingman Brewster and others invite Lindbergh, who was a very pro-German, and he was also a very big supporter of eugenics. And I document all of that. But that episode you're describing really reflected Yale's commitment to fascism on the campus. And it was an ugly fight, and it was only a block away from where you are now. As the kids were students, some local students and others who were beaten on, forced down the street, and pummeled. And all of that was documented. All that comes out of the Register and more importantly, the Yale Daily News. And at the same, it's during that episode, it's the day after that episode, that the students show up at the Yale Columbia game, are feted, elevated, they sing the fascist national anthem in the middle of the field. And that evening, Wilbercross hosts a grand dinner where he praises Mussolini and the students at a local, I think it was in West Haven, where the event was held. And all of that, again, is documented in the book. So yeah, you are proximate, and it's actually more problematic than that. Dick Lee and the Yale architects were prepared to demolish your building during urban renewal. It was on the list of buildings that should go.
That's right.
And it was the historic preservation people who finally woke up after most of New Haven had been destroyed and harmed, but finally came to the defense of these historic buildings, including the library you now sit in.
Could have been a McDonald's fast food chain.
It could have been. Now the Yale architects would have done one of their classic egotistical modern displays of whatever they could rationalize it being. But New Haven would have been very different if they had succeeded.
But getting back to Wilbercross, a few years ago, there was talk of renaming it. I mean, there was, I think, a New Haven Independent article. So I think it's lost steam, but it's interesting.
Well, you may recall in the book, in an endnote, after I describe Wilbercross's conduct, in the endnote, I go back to the Independent article from a couple of years ago. And what I get focused on is that the Yale historian who responded said, oh no, not Wilbercross. He would never do such a thing. And just dismissed it with a kind of arrogant simplicity as if, well, I'm the Yale historian, that would never happen. And so I was able to find not only the full report that was done, but Wilbercross's very strong affirmation of his acceptance of it, the value of it, the importance of it. Wilbercross was deeply involved in it, as he had been historically in this same notion. So the Yale historian was not only inaccurate, it was worse than that. So whether that debate is worth having again, I don't know, but the Independent and Paul Bass were right on the nose.
I just want to reach out to folks. If you have a question, comments, please feel free. Let me see, I don't see anything. Okay. You know, it's interesting you bring up Bart Guide, another mayoral, what was he for 6 years? And, you know, it's funny, when I was in high school, we had an Earth Day club and we went to visit him. He kind of like poo-pooed us. He said, not of interest. I mean, it was the growing, I guess, after Earth Day. And I didn't really think much of him as a mayor, but he really, I guess, I'm just curious his relation with Bart. And in some ways, he was a reformer, right? I mean, after Bart Guide is born.
More so than he's been given credit for, I think.
Okay.
He strongly opposed urban renewal. He could see what Dick Lee was doing. And urban renewal had caused great destruction, including in the neighborhood he represented, a massive highway, that big swerve into New Haven that was only necessary for the Oak Street connector and only intended to benefit the suburbs. And so he was aware of the harm, including the fact that is easily documentable, and I did it, of urban renewal never being intended to benefit New Haven. That there was this mythological entity created called the Quinnipiac Valley region. And Maurice Rodewald, the Yale architect and planner, he convinced Dick Lee, this is the purpose of urban renewal, and we have to tear out the center of New Haven. And Dick Lee bought off on that, and he contracted with Rotowall with that purpose in mind. So urban renewal, and this is so fundamentally important, and Giamatti knew it, was never intended to benefit New Haven. It was intended to benefit the suburbs. And so all this massive destruction that occurred, including in Worcester Square and parts of Fairhaven, what is sometimes referred to locally as Goatville, and that's where Giamatti was. I mean, that's where Bart Guyder was from. Was a real, really harmful, but the logic of it only emerges if you recognize that urban renewal was never intended to benefit New Haven. Yale knew that as well. Rotowall was from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one last thing before I get some questions. I mean, I grew up across from Hill House, and the new Hill House on Crescent Street. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I think it was a park before, and I'm just, it's amazing what, you know, you write about. I mean, in terms of the old campus, the connection, how inspiring it must have been when you went to school, the York Square campus, you know, for a lot of New Haven folks. And the fact that I think, was it Griswold cut out the New Haven scholarship?
Exactly right. And Bart Giamatti.
Yeah, that was, I want to bring that up, and that's so important. I mean, it really, what Bart did, you know, it's to cut off, I mean, one further step in terms of, you know, dissociating from the community, but it's, let me just, we have two questions, if you don't mind, Neil. Let's see.
No, please, by all means.
We have, let's see, Jonathan Weiner, is Mr. Proto planning to write the rest of the story? So I don't know what he means by the rest of the story.
Well, I think I can answer that question, but
sure.
The reason I stopped where I did was that Bart Giamatti's presidential papers are not available. You can't have access to them, nor are the papers of any of the members of his administration or the Yale Corporation, which had a lot of control over money, finances, et cetera. So that part of the story, I could not, as a historian, write. If I was a journalist, I would do it. But there's plenty of that stuff in the newspapers you can look at, and if you lend whatever credence to it you want. What I did do was, and so thinking of it as a historian and wanting documentation, and there are other entities you'd have to also look at that either do or don't have papers. Nonprofits, educational institutions that were dealing with Yale and Bart at the time. It turned out that Ben DeLito did not retain his papers, so we were trying to collect those. That would help in a dialogue. I have some of those, and they're now going to be available at Southern. So that was part of the reason. Labor has no papers, and so they don't have this wonderful chronology of correspondence, internal memoranda, who was doing what to whom. And so until all of that is available, if it's ever available, writing a continuation just wouldn't be historically proper. But I have written 3 articles on baseball, on Giamatti and baseball. And those are online, they're on my website, they're available easily. And they're worth reading. So in that extension of his life, I have done more.
Did you clear up the Pete Rose controversy?
Well, yeah, easily enough, I think. And I write about this on 2 occasions in these articles that I'm referring to. Probably the most important thing about Pete Rose takes 2 forms. One is, if you look at Giamatti's early life, you look at him as a young boy. And I got to interview all his childhood friends. What you really see is a person deeply committed to fairness. He gets some of this from his father, but he's playing these touch football games with big, tough kids on the other side. And what he insists on, he's the quarterback for his team. This is in grammar school. What he insists on is that everyone must play by the rules. None of this pushing, shoving, that you're big guys, doesn't matter. You got to play by the rules, because it's the only way merit, that is, those of us who are not big and strong like you guys are.
This is when he was in Holyoke, up in, right?
That's exactly right. When he was there at South Hadley, and his father was at Mount Holyoke. But He insists on that. And so you see this principle of fairness emerge throughout his entire life. It's one of the reasons he got in trouble at Yale, because he didn't like their notion of leadership, which they kept saying, you come here, you're going to be a leader. You can exclude other people. That's what he disliked about it. It was very condescending. But the notion of fairness in athletics was very important to him, because he had learned, and this really emerges in baseball, and his talks that he gives also reflect this, that he could see the number of men who tried to play in baseball but were excluded because the rules were, because people didn't abide by the rules. There was no fairness. And he said, no, we're not doing that. And he does use Jackie Robinson a couple of times as an example of baseball's failure, what it failed to do after it promised that someone like him could play this game, then it failed to insist on fairness right across the board. So when he gets to Pete Rose, he then confronts something else early on, which is he begins to recognize that Pete Rose is not insular. He's not alone. He's reflective of an attitude, of a mentality, and that's what he was troubled by. And Rose was lying, and he lied not only to baseball and to Giamatti and to his people that were helping Bart or to his hometown. He keeps lying for decades after that. He lies to his lawyers. The lawyers basically mislead the court. He is lying right. He lies to the publisher of a couple of books. They publish him anyhow. They try to defend him. And so what Giamatti was focused on was fairness. And second of all, Rose was the beginning of a problem. And of course, after Giamatti dies, the problem emerges. Cheating is widespread and was very ugly, and baseball didn't seem to know what to do with it. But Giamatti did.
Okay, rolling in, Robert Sandine. I think he was a neighbor of mine on Glen Road. This is good. It's like community forum here. So Robert Sandine writes, I was a friend of Bart's. Tell me more about his fearlessness.
Well, I can tell you that I heard it 3 times. I heard that word 3 times in my interviews. The first one was from his childhood friends, and it emerged in a couple of ways. One was on the football field, that he could get slammed. As long as everybody was playing by the rules, he was I heard this for the first time, he was fearless in dealing with these big kids. He didn't mind getting slammed, but he was tough. The second one was in classrooms, that they'd have these debates, and you'd have to sort of reach in and grab a subject matter and then just start talking about it. And his classmates who were on the debate team with him said he was fearless in the way he just reached in, grabbed it, and started to talk in the most erudite, thoughtful way possible. Then I heard the term again at Princeton, where I talked to one of his close friends, this fellow named Bob Hollander, who was a professor of Renaissance, especially Dante. And Hollander used the term to describe Bart's commitment to truth. He was fearless in his commitment to seeking the truth. That was the second time I heard it. And the third was when the president of Notre Dame, Theodore Hesburgh, who was a very profound leader in civil rights in the United States, he referred to Giamatti in giving him an award, an honorary degree, as fearless in terms of taking on people that were harming Yale, harming education. This is really the moral majority, you remember. We're of an age where we would remember. And also harming the community. And so fearless was the term he used. So that's where the title really, finally, that's what struck me as relevant to what I was focused on.
You have Aaron Good. What was Bart's role, if any, in the machinist strike at the Winchester factory in 1979? So that would have been, he would have been president a year by then? Would he have been president in 79?
Yes, he would have been. The answer is I don't know, because those, when I was looking at that, I didn't hear his name or read his name. When I was looking at the history of it in other ways, I didn't find it referenced in the newspapers or anything like that. This is mostly when Frank Loeb was the mayor. And I didn't have access to his paper, so there was something else going on there. I don't know it. As you do know, once those strikes ended and Winchester and others left, or looked like they were going to leave, New Haven then was confronted with the harsh reality of what do we do with that site? And so then you get into something that I have some familiarity with, because at the time I had already, I was fighting these suburban shopping malls. And so I was closer to what was going on in New Haven and to Toledo. And I can say that then Yale was involved, because New Haven turned to Yale to try to find a solution to what do we do with this space? How do we somehow make it viable and so on. What happened since that time, I don't know, but I do know that Bart was involved in that discussion.
Since you bring up Frank Loeb, his brother Ed Loeb played a role in wasn't he in the Lee administration?
Yes, he was the chief economic development administrator, and clearly a product of the Yale, what I keep characterizing as eugenics mentality. It was really an elitist notion of we're going to tell you what to do and be like us. Do what we tell you to do. And he just had his own vision and no one else mattered. And I'm not the first one to say that. But the effect of his attitude was really rough and harsh and ugly and really misled a lot of people, but very much a product of that Yale elitism that caused a lot of harm in New Haven. And one thing else that happened during that time, and you can still see it played out in New Haven today, when I read The Independent, I see this. What came with urban renewal, and Loeb was a part of this, and it really is reflected in this whole notion of the Quinnipiac Valley region and suburbia. It was a suburban zoning mentality, that you got the imposition in New Haven of separating out workspaces from living spaces, consolidating retail. You can see that still remnants of that in Dixwell, building suburban kind of construction in New Haven. And you can see that in Fairhaven. It's, again, you can see it in Dixwell. And so now what you see finally, and it's interesting for me to read, and that is people arguing and wanting neighborhoods back, and dealing really with still a suburban zoning that so harmed them and had such a history. And Loeb would have been absolutely aware of this, just like Dick Lee was. It had a history of being based on discrimination. It was all about immigrants and African Americans. That's what that zoning was about, how to characterize them as public nuisances. And it was finally upheld by the Supreme Court. But that's at base, that's what it was about. That gets played out in New Haven.
Good. We've got two more questions. I think that's in terms of timing. I think I'll keep it that. Maria asks, is there anything to say about A. Bart's mom? Interesting.
I actually write a great deal about it. She's a very interesting woman and very important in his life. Well-educated, knew theater, most importantly, spoke Italian, learned a lot about Italian history, and Bart's mother and father met and this is where the prologue of the book begins, met on a ship, both on their way to study in Italy. She was in her junior year at Smith, and he had just graduated from Yale and was entering into the graduate program. They met on that ship, both on their way to Italy. So she was extraordinarily well informed, actually, clearly a wonderful mother, thoughtful. His childhood friends talk a lot about her, but very intelligent and deep into theater too, which does play out as well in Bart's father's life, but more importantly in his life. His wife, Toni, was at the Yale Drama School when Bart and she met, and he was also a member of the Yale Dramatic Association, Yale Dramat, as it's now called.
Okay, Paula Panzarella is asking, considering Yale's involvement with urban renewal, do you think this is why the Route 34 connector has remained barren and is for the most part serving as a parking lot for the university and hospital?
The answer is unequivocally yes. Those roadway changes were intended to destroy neighborhoods and open up space. And you'll see that in most of that, it's Yale that's filled at the Yale Medical School. And the medical school historically was frustrated because urban renewal, and I document this in the book, wasn't moving fast enough to move African Americans out. And at that point, Puerto Ricans as well, who had come into New Haven. So Route 34, and also Route 34 was part of what was called the Ring Road. It was going to be even more expansive. It was going to encircle Yale in order to protect it. And it was people like Bruce Morris, but at that time, who opposed it, when Kingman Brewster and Mary Griswold supported it. Mary Griswold was the wife of the president, but she was a state representative. They supported it with Dick Lee. The opposition came from these aldermen, as they were then called, in Fairhaven, and Bart Gaida in Goatville, because they had experienced the harm. They weren't going to let it happen again. But Bruce Morris ultimately was the one who killed it in Hartford. So Route 34 was part of a much broader Ring Road, as it was called, which was intended to displace yet more people and force them out to the suburbs or into public housing.
A comment from, let's see, Debbie Elkin, she said she remembers Ed Loeb worked for the union at Yale when it was founded in the 1940s. Interesting contradiction. So just
I agree, he lost his way. That's what that implies. I couldn't agree more.
Okay, and then well, Paul Panzarella has an interesting comment, like we've all talked about. I remember Legion Avenue delis and bakeries, going there with my parents. I don't remember my folks talking much about the demolition. I think they felt the old Jewish community was displaced and replaced by Black and Puerto Ricans moving to the area. My folks always remained nostalgic about Legion Avenue, but they no longer felt their neighborhood was being destroyed in the 60s. So see that, I mean, we look at Legion Avenue, we're going like 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s. What's your sense of?
No, I think Seth, you're right. I think that one of the great virtues of those communities, and I document this in the book, you've got African Americans talking about how beautifully integrated those neighborhoods were, that how valuable they were, what they learned. You get opportunities that existed in those neighborhoods, and that's what urban renewal destroyed. Those small business opportunities that people could enter into and engage in, and then grow and move and do other things. That all got destroyed by urban renewal. So those neighborhoods really reflected an integration and diversity among working class people that and businesses of all kinds that were very successful, including large ones, that was destroyed. When John Daniels and others wrote about the anticipated harm that was going to come, the possibility of a civil disorder, which did come, they were focused on the loss of opportunities and how that had been lost to a lot of these people who had moved in, including African Americans. So urban renewal had great harm, cultural harm. And then, of course, what Paula is referring to in part was what got left, where these sort of standalone synagogues, standalone civic buildings, standalone churches, where everyone who used to go to them was gone, forced out. And I will, one last thing about the riot that did occur, the civil disturbance that occurred. And this is in the book. 25% of the people who were arrested didn't come from those neighborhoods. They were from elsewhere. And the riots occurred all over the city. And even the police department said to Dick Lee in this report, this is a failure. Your efforts have failed. He could not have been happy with that. But it was abundantly clear that it wasn't just it wasn't a riot in some conventional sense. It was cultural, it was deep, it was imperative, and it involved a broad range of people all over the city in ways that actually surprised me.
So it's getting to 1. I don't see any other questions. Just a Dick Lee comment. It's interesting. I don't say redeeming value, but was he the first mayor to hire an African-American corp counsel? I think Crawford, right? Was this, I'm looking, his legacy. I mean, aside from what he did, in terms of, Oak Street Connector and this, creating this havoc. Did you bring that up in the book? I forgot if there was anything.
There is an endnote that says it,
Yeah.
but I think it's one of those facts that gets elevated beyond what it's worth.
Okay.
It's sort of like, okay, well, that's nice, but we're already into the 50s or 60s. Well, so it's not like there weren't African-American lawyers around or members of the bar or skilled people. And so, okay, that's great. Next, what's next? What else did you do? And the strongest opposition from him historically came from the African-American neighborhoods. He only had the benefit of 1961. They saved him because they were Democrats. They wanted to elect John Daniels. They wanted to elect Bruce Morris and others. And Ella Scantlebury, it's the first time she ran for office. So, but the blacks demonstrated against him. They despised urban renewal. They despised what he did in the Hill. All they saw was upper class housing. They said, we don't want that. We don't want you to do what you did on Legion Avenue in the Dixville and New Hall areas. So they couldn't stop all the harm that occurred. So there was no good reputation between him and the African-American community.
So I just want to mention, Neil, you'll be speaking via Zoom close to home, Orange, at the Case Memorial Library. You can continue the conversation December 14th at 7 p.m. In the chat, I put the number if you want more information. I want to thank you for being part of this. It's been a great discussion. There's a lot we wanted to talk about. So much to talk about. It's an interesting, we didn't talk about the Mount Holyoke days of Al Giamatti, which I thought was great. I mean, in terms of, we talk about just leaving it at this and, this creeping fascism and the anti-communism of the 50s, the McCarthy era. And I think at Mount Holyoke, I think they resisted. I don't know about at Yale. I mean, I think Yale was more complicit. I think, did you have to take an oath at Yale, or is this a loyalty oath? Was that?
Griswold made plain. He said, look, there's no communists at Yale. I've done the survey. I did. I quote him saying that. Don't worry, we have no communists here. I've done it.
Right.
But there is a wonderful story about Giamatti, and probably the most important thing, and maybe this is the right place to end this, is that he had a deep commitment to civic responsibility, and that's where his son got it. His son got it as a model. He saw it, and being a responsible citizen was part of what he did in civic terms. And it's what Bart brought to bear. It's what he talked about repeatedly at Yale that caused him such tension, and of course since been abandoned. They're back to leaders. The elitism of leaders. In any event, that comes out of Mount Holyoke experience in that time era. Anyhow, thank you for having me.
Thanks again. And hopefully we'll get you back on your book about Lilio Kalani. That'd be interesting. You're kind of like Mark Twain. You have this anti-imperialist. I think that what we did in Hawaii, I'm going to elevate you, Neil, to the anti-imperialist group. But
actually, from you, that's a compliment, and I appreciate that. And if you do get me back, I'd be happy to talk about, because I've spent enormous amounts of time in Hawaii as a lawyer as well as writing.
Oh, great. Well.
Oh, no, I did a lot of work there. And there's a whole website of mine that's devoted to that you might want to take. But I'd be happy to come back. I always enjoyed being at the New Haven Public Library.
Good. Okay. Thanks, everybody, for joining.